Speciation is another one of those questions where you actually can learn almost a memo answer and then just tailor it to the example that they've given you. So when we look at speciation, we normally talk about this process called allopatric speciation. So what allopatric speciation is, it's when a population becomes separated by a geographic barrier. So that geographic barrier might be the mountain, it might be the sea, etc. So when we're looking at the other type of speciation, which was sympatric speciation, we normally there are talk about what mechanisms are in place to keep species that are different from being reproductively isolated, meaning what stops different species from reproducing with each other. So that would be the plants being adapted to different pollinators, birds having different courtship rituals, etc. So that's a different studying thing altogether. But this question looks at the present-day distribution of three closely related species of the dog family, coyote, jackal, and dingo, being shown on the world map below. What type of evidence for evolution is represented here? Now remember, we get fossil evidence, genetic evidence, biogeography, and this would be biogeography, which is the present-day distribution of living organisms across the world. What is a biological species? A group of individuals that look similar, can interbreed, and produce fertile offspring. But I want to focus on question 3.2.3. And this question that I'm looking at in this past paper is from NSC Paper 2 2021. So you can go through that on your own if you want. Describe how these three species could have evolved from a common ancestor. So this is speciation, because you can also tell from the mark allocation. A 7-mark question will be a question on speciation or natural selection, for example. So, first point is saying the original population or common ancestor lived on one large continent, because this is looking at continental drift taking place, which led to these species being separated, even though they were once altogether as one species. So they lived on one large continent and became separated by continental drift or by the oceans. That's our geographic barrier. You always need to identify for speciation what is the geographic barrier. In this case, the continents drifting apart or the oceans separating them. There was no gene flow between the three populations. Sometimes it'll be two groups or two populations. In this case, in this paper, it was a compulsory mark to say between the three populations and not three species, please. They were not new species yet. It was a common ancestor that was one species, one population, group of individuals in the same species living in a defined area that became separated. So it's like us as humans being all over the world. We are all still humans, so we are one species, but we are different populations all over the world. Now, key thing, each population experienced different environmental conditions and underwent natural selection independently. So one population might have been in a hot, dry environment. One population might have been in a cooler, wetter environment. But those different conditions led for different traits to be selected for or against in natural selection. You do not need to go into any more detail here for natural selection. That is it. Each population experienced different conditions in the environment and underwent natural selection independently. These words you must say as they are. Don't try to find synonyms for it. And then what happens is the individuals in each population become different, genotypically and phenotypically. So you can say they become genotypically and phenotypically different. But that means the genotype changed, therefore the phenotype changed. Now, even if the three populations were to mix again, they would be unable to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That means they are now different species. So, thus, the three different species, the coyote, jackal, and dingo, were formed. This was also a compulsory mark, naming the three different species, because the question said, describe how these three species could have evolved. So you had to name the three species in the end. So let's have a look at the parts of this answer that are actually generic parts that you then just slightly change for a different question that you are asked. So you always need to identify the original population. But actually in this case, living on one large continent is very specific to this question. But you do get a mark for what the original population becomes separated by some sort of geographic barrier. So then you just alter this little part over here, the continental drift and the oceans, to decide what is the geographic barrier. It might be a mountain, it might be a river. There was no gene flow between the groups. Might not be 3 populations, but in this case it was 3. This is always a point. Each population experienced different environmental conditions and underwent natural selection independently. That is always a mark. So if you have no cooking clue what you're talking about, at least try and get to that point. These are also marks. The individuals in each population became different genotypically and phenotypically. Again, key, because we're starting to see a change in the groups. If the populations were to mix again, so if they were brought into contact, they would be unable to interbreed, or they would be unable to produce fertile offspring. And then thus, different species were formed. So again, you tailor that for the specific question. So if you look again, that a lot of these parts are actually quite generic. There's no gene flow. Each population experienced different environmental conditions and underwent natural selection independently. Individuals became different genotypically and phenotypically. If they mixed again, they would be unable to interbreed. Those are like generic marks for whatever question you're looking at. So when you're learning speciation, you need to learn it as clearly as you possibly can. And then just tailor make it so that if there are compulsory marks in the question, like this was a compulsory mark to our 3 populations and naming the 3 species, then you are getting those 2. Because otherwise you're only going to get a maximum of 5 out of 7. So you want to make sure you are good at tailoring the answer to the specific question that they ask you. One thing to note, I put a dash on here, a slash, because that's from the memo, because it was just 2 different options of saying the same thing. You must never, ever, ever put words in brackets or behind a slash in an exam paper in finals, because we will mark your first answer. So even if your first one is wrong and your second part is right, we don't mark that. So don't use brackets or slashes in your final exams.